So good morning to all of you. Welcome to all of you. I will moderate this roundtable, Braving Risks, with Mr. TRAINAR from the Cercle des économistes, who will be talking about a cultural change in the face of risks. You remember the major crisis that buffeted us in 2008, and since then there's a world characterized by aversion to risk. So you cannot grow much, and productivity gains have been lessened. So we'll be talking about changes and the emergency to have a new paradigm. Eric Pinon, you have the president of the French Association of Financial Management. It's been the case since 2017. You are an advisor of La Financière de l'Échos. You started working with Michel Puget with different positions in terms of asset management. Antoine, LISSOWSKI, you are the chief executive officer of CNP Assurance. So you were in charge of European Insurance Federation. You focused on insolvency too, and you worked at the Deposit and Consignment Office, and you worked for the Banking Commission. We have Manu BHASKARAN. Good morning or good evening, I don't know. So you are the CEO of Centennial Asia Advisors, and before you worked for Société Générale in the investment banking in Asia at the analyst department, and before you worked for the Defense Ministry of Singapore. And Brigitte, good morning. You are the president of AMRAE, risk management and insurance management, and you're working with the Ministry of Economy in order to hedge companies when they are faced with exceptional events, and you are a board member of Thales Group. So good morning to all of you. Philippe TRAINAR will present us with a topic. Good morning. Defying Risks, Braving Risks. This is an ambitious title. And I think that with the COVID-19 pandemic, risks are at the uppermost on the agenda. Of course, it's very difficult to define risks. We know that there are risks that are opportunities. There are some risks that we need to be aware of, because these risks can be opportunities but can be fatal. There are risks that we can't avoid, that we need to monitor, to manage in order to limit those risks. And there are some risks that we need to avoid at any price. They could be transferred to third parties, insurers or investors, or we could exclude risks if only it's possible. I think that states would have liked to exclude the pandemic risks, but the pandemic risk was imposed upon them. So it's very difficult to gauge the risks. Where are those risks? So define the risks. So who should be responsible for that? So you can brave risks if you can get a gain, a psychological gain. For example, with the film with James Dean, The Desire to Live, you can brave risks. So we think that with an opportunity there can be a gain, and if you want to nurture an opportunity, you need to focus on costs, you need to invest in capital. But there's always risk-taking when you want to tap an opportunity, because the costs can be higher than the gains. But of course, it's not only a matter of looking for some opportunities when it comes to defying risks. You can braving risks that you haven't chosen. So soldiers know that when you avoid risks, it can be disastrous. It can be much more disastrous than confronting risks. So what is at stake? It's not a matter of maximizing profit, as it is the case with the maximization of opportunities. So we know that we need to reduce the cost of an avoidable risk by prevention through precautionary measures or through the management of crises. But when we talk about costs, there's another question. How do we share the risks that we defy or we brave? According to the economy, it's always optimal to share risks, the risks that are random, the risks that you sustain, but shared risks through the market or shared risks through the action of the state, through redistribution. This is what I would call pooling or diversification of random risks. And this underpins insurance business. So the risks will not be sustained by too many people over a period of time. So risks are transferred from a person who is overexposed to a less exposed person through a bonus, a risk-based bonus or risk-based premium. And of course, we have to be prudent, otherwise the price of the risk transfer will change. But is it optimal to share a risk that we are all unilaterally exposed? So there's a classic theory. The capitalistic entrepreneur will take risks and he will be remunerated by a variable part, negative or positive, and he will be the risk taker. Tapping the opportunities. The entrepreneur is not the only one to take risks. Employees also take risks. So premium layoffs are sharing mechanisms. There's another sharing mechanism in terms of risk-taking credit, and beyond that, the monetary policies. This is something that we've experienced every day. When collective risk-taking is too high for different reasons, you have the decrease in rates in order to offset the risk premium. So when you share risks, it means that the risk that you brave should be well managed according to the social standards. Any discrepancy will bring about an increase in prices, especially when you want to transfer the risks. So this is the core of our topic. So braving risks is a matter of means. Risk management should be imposed. It should be more independent. It shouldn't be subservient to other things, subservient to the financial divisions and to the communication divisions. It shouldn't be confined to some sophisticated forms that are very demanding. And risks shouldn't be confined to some sectors that have made headway since 2008 or since the financial crisis or the Chernobyl disaster. But this process should be expanded to society as a whole. It should cover the profitable sector. Companies should have a risk management policy, and NGOs should have a risk management policy. And some NGOs, faced major problems because they didn't have a risk management policy. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've noticed that not anticipating the risk can bring about high costs. So productivity gains have dropped, and they could write off growth, and growth could be negative. And of course, it has been related to the loss of risk-taking. Of course, the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century was faced with Europe at that time. And Europe and the United States had to address some questions. How can we avoid the slowdown of productivity gains? How can we take more risks? How can we manage the risks that are imposed upon us? And it's not a good idea to transfer risks to others, and we have to make sure that people contribute to risk management. How can we work on sharing mechanisms that need to go through the market? And when the market has reached some limitations, there should be some collective public mechanisms in order to offset the whole process. It's a broad topic. The different speakers will be able to highlight a specific dimension. Eric Pinon, how can you promote risk taking? Is it possible? What needs to be changed? Thank you for giving me the floor. Philippe has just delivered a presentation. I'm quite reluctant to use the word risks in terms of investments. I will give you a definition of risk. The possibility, the likelihood of an event, of a contingency. So when we use risks, we need to think in terms of taking risks or incurring risks. And today we are talking about defying risks or braving risks. So we shouldn't be too concerned with risks. So I can tell you that in terms of history, remember the 2008 crisis. Of course, there was another crisis in 2011, the European currency crisis. But if you consider the saving products for the small investors, they can invest without any risks for many reasons. You have state data, and there are some institutions that can give money to states without a high debt level. All the portfolio management companies, insurers, are able to demonstrate that a well-controlled risk can provide a connected yield, an associated yield. This is what I want to tell you. We are at the end of a period that we didn't anticipate. We thought that we couldn't go through such an event. Of course, we had World War II. We faced some crises in the past. We faced some economic slumps. But there's something that it is quite insightful. We want to find people who are able to brave risks, to defy risks, the financial risks. What does it mean to trust the people who are in charge of savings that will be proposed or kept? And secondly, there's another essential point. We have to link risk culture to wealth sharing. So back to what has been said about pooling. So if I want to participate in value creation, I need not to be as prudent as some people would like me to be. So in terms of risks, you need to consider the time frame, the time horizon. So if we want the risk-saving programs to stabilize, it's important to focus on risk destination and risk horizon. French savings, for example, could be useful for 3 months. We're almost on holiday, but people can use their savings to go on holiday. They can take some short-term decisions. So they will have a 3-month savings program in order to help their children. And with life expectancy, you can have a 20-year saving program to fund retirement and pensions. Of course, we don't use the term pension funds in France. Of course, I will use it, and I hope that everybody I hope that nobody will be shocked. So we are using life insurance products, but today we are in a situation whereby savings is very cautious, and we focus too much on the past because the rates were low, and with low rates it was possible to get a certain yield, but people didn't take risk. There was no risk taking, but companies took risks. So, for example, it's not possible to get a 0.5% yield with your employee savings book. What is important is to focus on the long term, on a long-term horizon. So back to your question. So savers, investors should trust the players and stakeholders. So the savers should make sure that when they invest, people should benefit from it. We have lots of projects, so we want to have a sustainable savings program. You have lots of investments, mid-term or long-term investments. What is important is to focus on duration and time frame. Time flies, by the way, so it's important to focus on yields and remember what Mr. Kennedy said in 1961. Don't ask what your country can do for you. Ask yourself what you can do for your country. Savers and investors should ask the following question. Think about what you can bring to the economy, and your savings will be more productive with a higher yield. And if we do so, we will have braved or defied the risks. I will give the floor to Antoine LISSOWSKI, an insurer, the protector, the investor alike. So we've already kick-started the debate, by the way. So as an insurer, what kinds of risks are we talking about? There is a series of risks, of course, that we can envisage. There are different approaches. So you can have a look at the risks on the internet, and you have a different grading regarding the risks. So nuclear protection industry, what are the main risks? Unemployment, insecurity, poverty, economic problems, climate issues. So this is a first approach. Then we are talking about insurers and risk managers in insurance companies. They classify the risks. They have a look at the 23 risks, and these risks are ranked. So first risk, cyber attacks, financial crises, the degrading economic environment, and climate change. The year before, these were the same risks. So pandemic risk is also included in the ranking. 23rd place out of 23 risks. So nobody's at a prophet in this country, so we have to be modest. And in Davos, they produce a report on global risks, heat wave, climate change, climate disorders, climate disaster, loss of biodiversity, weapons of mass destruction. So at Davos, they've been producing this report since 2017, and from one year to another, risks ranking changes. So the issue of risks is a matter of perception by the public at large, by institutions, by authorities. So the perception about risks can differ. It does change over time. And back to what Eric told us, risks are different according to the time horizon, long time horizon or short time horizon. So we are in an environment of emotions. So it's very difficult for professionals who want to brave risks when you have lots of emotions. So how do we lessen, mitigate emotions? So we will protect people. We will tell people to set aside some money so that people can get some income in order to handle the risks. So I'm not going to talk about families or states, but allow me to talk about pooling or mutualization through finance. So we are professionals in risk pooling or in risks mutualization. So if there's a risk, if a risk emerges, it's important to set aside some money. It's important to save money. So there's a kind of tension. So when people fear risks for different reasons, they don't want to have risks with their savings. And if you consider the current situation, you have a pandemic crisis, you have a health crisis, you have an economic crisis, and you need to use risks in order to invest, in order to move away from the economic crisis. And when you consider the situation today, people are adopting inward-looking attitudes. When you have a look at flows in France, we've said that there is a 70 billion worth of savings, extra savings. When you have a look at savings where it is based in banks, deposit accounts, in the employee savings book, not in life insurance, not much in management. So people want to fall back to something that is very secure. So when you have a look at the household savings, 5,400 billion euros. So what do you have? 300 billion euros with direct shares, 1,000 billion shares that are not listed. This is what we call private equity of entrepreneurs, and for the remainder, 3,700 billion euros, you have bonds, debentures, life insurance, debentures, and bonds. So what is the share of the 5,400 billion euros intermediated by bankers, insurers, or asset managers? I would say almost all of them. So the whole saving risk is managed with bankers, intermediaries, asset managers, and brokers alike. And we need to help people in terms of risk management. So there are two approaches. So it's important to inform people, to educate people. It's important to share knowledge. So how do we analyze risk? How do you analyze the risk of the product that will be on offer? So it's a matter of experts. So we need to share our expertise with people.
That's what bankers and insurers do on a general basis. There's another dimension. How do we share risk with people? So the bankers, insurers are taking the risk and they sell it on after having managed it with clients in their contracts. And so there's a notion of sharing there. Our business is then requires us to be transparent, and we have to take on the risk that the client does not wish to keep. It's quite difficult to be transparent. There's been a few issues with insurers recently, but they thought something was really transparent, but it was only the specialists who could understand it. For a time, they stressed the fact that they thought it was very clear, but when everyone's emotions are raw, it's quite difficult. And I'd like to finish with this. One of the problems that we're encountering today is that given the challenge of public emotion in terms of risk, and it's conveyed by MPs and the population in general, we have to regulate or over-regulate financial intermediaries. So we are governed by all kinds of rules and regulations. I've not got a problem with that, but it's a problem when there are too many rules and regulations. To sell an insurance contract today, 25 minutes are needed to explain the policy. So So, if you're addressing a client, an old lady of 82, how much risk do you want to take, madam? Yes, you have to fill in that box. And if you buy shares, you have to have your own capital. But no one, I'm happy to buy them. But yes, you have to add your own capital. That's the problem. So we see that nowadays embracing risk is very difficult. The regulators have to embrace their own worries, their own anguish, because if we got rid of the anguish, there'd be no more risk left. We're going to change our continent now to go to Asia. We are going to a place where is the epicenter of many risks today. We've got Manu. Are you with us today? How are governments in Asia managing to promote risk-taking on your continent today?
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to, as you suggest, focus on risks from the Asian perspective, and what I'd like to do is two things. First, to outline the risks that we see facing, and then secondly, to suggest some ways in which Asian governments are dealing with these risks. So first of all, let me talk about the challenging risk environment, and I won't be comprehensive, but just to outline the major risks that we face. One is, of course, the continuing risk of pandemics. This coronavirus is going to stay with us for a while. There will be public health crises. There could be other pandemics as well. We recently found that there's a new we have geopolitical risks. I believe that the deterioration in China's relations with the United States has now gone beyond the point of no return. And unfortunately, East and Southeast Asia will be the main arenas for that contestation. And that's something we have to deal with. Third risk is trade protectionism and the slower pace of globalization. The flow of goods and services and capital and people was so profoundly important for Asia's development, but that is now at risk. The fourth risk is the likelihood of greater financial, the huge amounts of liquidity that the central, I think, will create of our markets abruptly and cause wild swings in asset prices, in currencies, in bond yields. Finally, there is the great disruption from many technologies that are reaching points of takeoff simultaneously, whether it's artificial intelligence or robotics or big data, or renewables, biomedical advances. There are many. So there are all these risks. The question then is, how do we manage these risks? The nature of these risks, I think, requires state intervention on a broader scale than before. And it is good to see that the Asian governments, at least some of them, understand this and are beginning to implement measures to mitigate these risks. For instance, in terms of the managing pandemics, we now have a successful template that we have learned from the successful countries such as China and New Zealand and so on. It involves strong institutional capacity in healthcare. It involves the political leaders making good judgments, and it involves strong communities so that the spontaneous bottom-up measures needed to control pandemics can be implemented. In terms of the risks, geopolitics, slow globalization, and technology risks, what Asian governments are doing is trying to learn to pool the risks in a way by stepping up regional integration, by forming more alliances so that we take cover and have protection from many friends who can help us if there's a crisis. So regional integration initiatives have recently been stepped up. We have, for instance, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has already been implemented. And we have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is much broader and involves China as well, which should be signed by the end of this year. And in addition, we have many other bilateral free trade agreements that are underway. So these alliances, we hope, will help to protect us in a much more difficult world. But we also understand that a lot needs to be done at the domestic level. And the strategy is beginning to take shape, and it involves addressing the structural weaknesses in our economies that have long been present but unfortunately were not addressed before. So, for instance, in many parts of Asia today, there is an extraordinarily large push to address infrastructure weaknesses. And the amounts of money being spent to improve roads and railways and ports and mass transit, multiples of what was being spent 5 years ago. And this is pretty much the case, not just in China, but even in India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which had been severe laggards in the past. So, in addition, across Asia, we are seeing a huge effort also to address weaknesses in the business environment by deregulation, improving the way the government interacts with business. And this has resulted in some improvements in the business ecosystem, also helping to attract investment and protect us from downsides to growth. In other words, to conclude, it is going to be a very rough and challenging world for Asia. It is going to be very difficult for us. With two big powers contesting in our backyard, there will be all kinds of unexpected problems that we'll have to deal with. In addition, you have all the other issues in the economics sphere. And what we realize is that we need to build resilience, which is the capacity to absorb the risk and to bounce back. And we need to develop the capacity for flexible adaptation to the longer term structural changes underway. If we can get those things done, those are the countries that will outperform the other countries in the region. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Merci. Thank you very much. Brigitte BOUQUOT, you are now going to talk to us about risk management in business. So what challenges are being faced today? Thank you very much, Isabelle. Through AMRAE, our association, I represent people in the real economy who are working on international markets. And this crisis really has underlined the fact that the economy and all businesses have been exposed to international risks, and that has reinforced our convictions at AMRAE. Our conviction is that we have to shift the paradigm. We can't make a sustainable economy if we do not build risk management into your business. That's what I focus on, and Philippe was very clear in talking about that. So, to tie in with what the previous speaker said, life on planet, life as a group, implies sharing risk, and risk sharing is for companies in the value chain and their stakeholders, including employees, but it's also experienced at state level because the citizen is expecting the state to protect them from certain risks, security, health, defense. So our group life is based on that contract of sharing risk, and that is why we see with demographic growth, with globalization, the impact on the planet, with social rifts, we see that there is a ramping up of systemic risks. COVID-19 put the spotlight on a side which is on a fact because the entire economy came to a stop. Insurers and risk managers who've been working on this kind of scenario for a long time saw that ramping up, saw that trend. And we all know that a business that takes risks to rise to an opportunity, that business takes their own risks, but also it is exposed to global risks and contributes to those global risks too. Risk management and risk insurance and reassurance, which has been developing risks in the oil and chemicals industry, for example, they are becoming bigger. They're becoming a specialist field in their own, an international specialist field. And companies who are floated on the stock exchange have the obligation to explain to their shareholders how the company is protecting itself. This is a discipline, enterprise risk management. This discipline is becoming more widespread. When you phrase it like that, it sounds very macroeconomic, and it sounds like you're going to make a big, you're going to map out risks around the world. But the picture isn't the important thing, although it is a good first step to understanding what's going on. The risks that we're creating, those that we are suffering. The important thing is, for a business, to have a policy to protect and ward off. So this is something which a business must do. The business has to take into account its own productivity, and when there's hot competition on the market, then the company leaders might tend not to focus on that. However, at the heart of the subject, in the real life economy, for a business to be sustainable, it has to invest in their top 5 risks, which they will have identified. They have to have a strong policy to invest for protection. Let's take the example of against fire, against floods, against natural catastrophes. That's a kind of investment. There's other investments in protecting your digital technology, protection against cyber attacks. There are investments that are cultural to a business, protecting the health of the workers, for example, and protecting against corruption. At AMRAE, our association of insurers, we recognize that there are many solutions and that businesses have to grasp those opportunities if they want to survive, and they have to convince their boards and their shareholders and their investors to earmark enough funds for risk management. This is so important, all-determining, in fact. We don't talk about it enough. And businesses don't always do what they need to do, particularly the smaller businesses. It's a priority. The priority isn't the insurance itself. You don't go straight from risk analysis to insurance. You just have to have the right policy in place to begin with. And that will ensure that any unexpected scenario, any systemic risk which is going to show up will be less systemic for the economy. And in this way, we will be able to pool those risks and provide insurance solutions, which are anyway vital for the resilience of any company. I would also like to add that, and this is the way Europe is approaching its Green Deal, we can construct an economic strategy on risk management. The way the world is being transformed as we're trying to do, because the youngsters, for example, don't want pollution and stuff anymore. This is another way of relaunching the economy through risk, and it gives meaning to many actions. A lot of companies have constructed their roadmap by acting to reduce a risk, for example, or to stop worsening any risk. And that's why risk management is so important. It is a starting point for relaunching investment and to have an economy which is more resilient. That could be thanks to Europe, that could be, it sounds a bit idealistic perhaps, but we believe that the risk economy is an advantage for democracies, and we have to relaunch our economy, taking risk management into stuff. You've talked about Europe, very, very different in the United States. We've heard that. In Europe, is the ecosystem right? Is it changing to take these different factors into account? ESG, is that being taken into account? On the other hand, if I understand what Antoine LISSOWSKI has said, nothing is really being done to help productive investments. There's this kind of dichotomy here. It's an opposition within Europe. What do you think, Antoine? Well, yes, we can say that there's a tension between the two. However, because we're talking about ESG investments, clients and ourselves, we want to have investments that are cleaner, but as profitable as if we weren't applying this prism. So if you're only focusing on profitability, I'm not saying it makes things easy, but if you have a single objective, it's more simple to deploy. If you only make clean investments, same thing, easy to put in place. However, today, if we want to put two lenses on our investments, then you have to find the optimum angle. Well, it takes time and it takes a lot of hard work. But it does work, and we have been able to demonstrate, and we're doing that more and more frequently with our ESG work, that if you have one lens which excludes a certain type of investment because it's perhaps a pollutant or bad for human health, and it means that you can invest in profitability, which can be even higher for all of your assets. So when you're adding this extra complexity, it means that you have to be more attentive. However, but it does not mean that you're not going to get any yield. I agree with what Brigitte has just said and what Antoine has added. For us, as was said at the end of what Antoine was saying, that there are insurers, bankers, asset managers, they have a role to play. We, with ESG, you compared things with the States there, whereas Trump might have different ideas to those that we have here in France. However, I see that some Americans come to take up French products because today we really are the leaders in this field. Not only that leadership, that's what your association is saying. We, as investors, must encourage businesses to be as much on E as in S as in G and provide the solutions. Because this program here in X is handing the floor over to the youngsters between 18 and 28 years old. And the younger generation is going to push us to be more responsible. And if we all manage by the combinations of the insurers, the investments, and the youngsters, then businesses will evolve in the right direction. And at the end of the day, Europe may well become leaders because the Americans seem to be losing that slot. Yeah, to pinpoint this question, it's important to know how globalization is going to evolve. And it's interesting to see the interaction between the state and the economy and sovereignty. So global reasoning exclusively saying, for example, we're going to be in competition with the Americans, yes, that is a reality. However, I think there is room also for coherent, pragmatic initiatives, and the big French champions have outstanding risk management policies, and they have to continue. And they are managing to stand up to the competition. And we can develop a European model. However, the question remains, we mustn't over-communicate. We have to actually act. We need to have risk management policies. We need to invest. We need to have prevention plans in place. We have to prepare crisis cells. We have to foresee redundancy. And those companies that are surviving through COVID have been diverse, who are already working on resilience. Investing in resilience, well, resilience is inherent in all risks, if you like. The ability to react, a company's immunity system, if I can use that image, protecting against climate change, fire, and cyber attacks, the way that they will defend and recover, it means that their investment is very meaningful, and that's what we have to accentuate. Value chain by value chain in all businesses. A question to Manu now. How is Asia being redesigned now? You said that there are going to be some winning countries. So how are they incorporating these new strategies? And how are all these risks being taken into account in rules and regulations to push towards more responsible investing? Is that taken into account in Asia, and in which countries?
In terms of responsible investing, I have to admit that Asia is still some distance behind. In terms of ESG, for instance, we are still only in the early stages. What we're seeing is it's the larger companies that are more exposed to international investors who are beginning to take it seriously. We're seeing also companies where the state holding companies, Singapore, have a large stake. They are taking the lead to encourage people to move towards better sustainability policies, better governance policies. But to be very honest, I think a long way to go, and I guess we can learn a lot from Europe.
So, Philippe, you wanted to add something? No, I wanted to say that the question of risk or risk management is a question of optimization. To embrace the risk, you have to optimize your constraints. The only problem that we have today is that in the shadow of all of these different problems, we have the management of our risk-driven society means that we might exclude risk, become immunized against risk and avoid it and have a collective aversion to risk. I think it's extremely dangerous from 2 points of view. First of all, because we lose that culture of risk-taking. Second point, if you're immunized, if you've been inoculated against risk, and if someone's there to kind of wipe the slate clean, then I am going to take risks. I'm not just going to embrace risk. I'm going to take all of the bad risks that come along. I'm going to take drugs. I'm going to do this, that, and the other. So I'll be taking the bad risks. So there is, you need to be careful there. I think Antoine stressed the question of regulations. If we're going to exclude a systemic risk, there's only a way to do that, and that is to take all of the risks. That is to take maximum risk in relation to society. If we don't want revenue to go down, if we don't want the retired people to have to participate in the ups and downs of the wealth of the working population, then you're going to have to take action. If I'm a retired person, I'm going to be taking risks. Much more risks than I would have done normally. So I think we really do have to be very careful about that. And here we have a great challenge as we come out of COVID. How do we embrace the risk of COVID? It's not necessarily going along with partial dole, for example. On the contrary, we have to contain the risk. COVID, confinement, were good for the retired. Now the retirees have to participate in the recovery. Yeah, one of the listeners are saying here that the modern-day translation of embracing the risk means taking no risk at all. What do you think about that? Well, exactly what Philippe has just said. One of the proposals that we've been talking about, there's a transgenerational question. For political reasons, we have protected the generation that we all represent here around this table. We're about 50 years old, give or take. We don't have a risk in terms of our job or what kind of job we're going to have tomorrow. Another important point, you were talking about retirement, so I'm going to come back on that. Antoine and I have already talked at great length about this when there were laws being reviewed here in France. And that law was going to set the risks that were going to be taken. There were rules about levels of life that were the same. At the end of the 1950s, a retiree would survive for 7 years, whereas here we have 1.7 workers for one retiree, and a retiree will live for 20 years. So the economy is not at all the same. So I'd like to come back to what you said earlier on. We must not exclude risk. On the contrary, we have to assure investors and the population that there is a good return on that risk investment, and we have to take in charge if the 18 to 28-year-olds don't take care of their pension now, then no matter when they reach that retirement age, they will have difficulties. I think now, today, the idea of not, I think it's the idea that we don't block out the notion of risk from our reasoning. Yes, I wanted to come back on this because risk-taking in the world of investments and long-term investments, risk-taking has taken on another aspect over recent years, because before, when you didn't take risk, you could still earn some money. There were all kinds of state bonds, etc. You could earn 5%, for example. But with inflation, things have clouded over a bit. But anyway, people had the idea that they got yield. Now it's simple. If you get state bonds, you will lose money. And so it's minus something because you have to pay your commission and everything. So nowadays, everybody is either losing money or taking risk. And that notion of supporting and helping people to take risk decisions becomes so very important. I mentioned the regulators, the supervisors who are panicking when they hear about that situation, but everybody learns. Because we've been through crises, for example. But this is a general approach. I would also like to come back on the question of pandemics and prevention. Let's take a look at things quite simply. Today, we're all wearing masks. We've got the sanitizing gel with a few people around the table, etc. That has an economic cost to it. We are currently putting an economic cost on preventing the extension of that pandemic. We've done that. And we did it quite spontaneously. We realized that there is an economic cost. I'm not talking about minus 10% GDP, but it will have a cost. Society will have to adapt to that. We're going to accept. We're all going to accept that we're going to have to pay so that we don't become ill, not more ill than we were in the past. So all of these risks will gradually be integrated into the market mechanisms, price mechanisms, collective life mechanisms. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not saying, but it's just a natural evolution. We usually take measures to manage a risk after the risk has showed up, because we only realize that the risk is there afterwards. So what's that? How does that transpire in businesses today? What's that changing? Well, we have been working with insurance solutions so far. People would take risk, they buy insurance, and they were covered for the consequences. But in today's world, with the climate crisis, social revolt, and cyber attacks, the world can no longer be insured in the same way. The major risk insurance market is being changed. The governments don't want this volatility. So we have a major lever to activate, to understand that the priority for businesses is risk management. It's reflected in their profit and loss account. They have to reduce that risk because we're going to have repeated systemic crises. That really is important, and that really echoes what you were saying, and that has an impact on the behavior of individuals. There's a tipping point. Everybody has to grasp this question. As a citizen, as an employee, as a consumer, we all have to get to grips with this question of the risk that you're contributing to, that you are exposed to. We have to be a bit more enlightened. We have to teach in schools, etc. For businesses, let's get back to operational realities in businesses faced with COVID-19. It's true that has a cost.
il y a des...
In some situations, there are fresh constraints bringing about additional costs, and productivity problems could be compounded. Loss of markets, not to mention the economic sectors that have stopped. But there were some opportunities as well, because with constraints, there were productivity gains, potential for productivity gains with telecommuting. People were working at home. There were interesting things. Quick diversification practices. For example, the catering industry has organized drive-ins. So at the start of the lockdown, we could have better managed the health risk. But we need to avoid this situation whereby the whole country is locked down. So once you've folded the metal bar, it's very difficult to put it back in horizontally, I would say. This is what we did. So the spin-off effects will be long-lasting. We've talked about risk sharing. A word about the financial markets. I mean, they've produced some we've seen the social bonds and other kinds of bonds in order to share risks. Is it something that is significant? Do you think that savings will be using these products, or are these products too insurance-based? So there are some people who buy risks, but they need to know what they buy. And when you move into risk hedging, that is technically difficult. You cannot sell these products to anyone on a massive scale. So these products could be useful, but it's important to examine these risks, and this is the job of professionals. And for private citizens, these products could be sold, but they should be helped, and they should be given some advice. So if you refer to the financial market, it's sort of gimmick. So I will give you a product, I will give you a risk, and then try to handle the risk. And I don't want to hear about the risk anymore. But when we buy an instrument, there should be an alignment of interests between the people who designed the risk. So you take a bit of a risk, and then we share the risk, because I don't want to incur the risk alone and fully. So we have to get it right. Pooling risks means that lots of people have to share risks. So if you have only a few people who share risks, risks are not diluted enough. This is what Philippe told us, and this is something that I share with him. Of course, there's a wrong idea with technical products or risks. People will think that the risks will vanish into thin air, but that's not the case. Of course, there are some political issues, but at the end of the day, states, the French state, the European states managed to mint money. And then they decided to fund the furloughing schemes, the short-term working schemes. And some loans were granted to restaurants. It's a loan, it's not a donation. So they will have to redeem the money. So regarding financial products, the financial products are very technical, they are very sophisticated, and there's something that people need to bear in mind. If there are too few players, it won't be a good pooling solution. So the pandemic bond is of interest. When you have a systemic risk, we don't want to incur the risks of others, because when there's a pandemic, we are all exposed to risks. So it's not meaningful to transfer risks fully. But in some sectors, there are some exceptions. The pharmaceutical sector benefited from the pandemic. So through the financial market, you will be able to decipher things that are not obvious. There are some sectors that are less affected than others, so they will use your pandemic bond. So you can spread down, you can stagger the risk with the pandemic bond, and then you can find some avenues of pooling that are extremely difficult to find, even for an insurer. And the financial market might find a solution. So before the pandemic, you could have a disaster bond with a pandemic hedge, and the hedging was zero. But after the pandemic, it will have a price, because investors have noticed that the situation has changed. So who were the investors? You had some corporate treasurers, and you had family bondholders. So it was like a wealth tax that you could levy should there be a pandemic. So the financial market is very subtle, but we are not going to cover the whole planet. It's not like, I mean, with the CDS, credit default swap, I mean, you cannot cover the whole planet. And in 2008, I mean, the price that we paid was very dear. So there are some financial crises. What is the role of financial regulators? They have to take into account the critical risks and the low risks. So this is something that we already touched upon. We are not going to criticize too much the regulators and the control authorities. Antoine has alluded to that. So if there is too much regulation, there will be two phenomena. We will regulate things that are not yet anticipated, so there's a danger. And I think that we will conceal the risk culture of some people, so we would think that any risk could be hedged, and that's not always the case. And for our private customers and for insurance companies, Antoine mentioned the old lady. You have technical regulation. So what is important is to know your customers. What is important is for people to do their job correctly. And if I were to be honest, in some cases, I can't help people. So if we want to brave risks, and if we want people to defy risks in order to kickstart the economy, in order to have an economy that will create some value, why not? Of course, there will be new topics coming to the fore: ecology, ESG. We need to tell our regulators that risk sharing and the skills of our teams will imply that the customers won't be exposed to high risks, because we are professionals. The regulator is under the impression that even if he regulates us, he thinks that we present a danger. So let's head for Asia. The culture is different there, but you've talked about a Temasek fund. So what is the allocation between a private equity, sure assets? So what about the allocation of risks as part of this fund?
The allocation, well, because of the challenge we have in deriving yield and return, there is a shift, a gradual shift in favor of private equity. But of course, the industry is less developed in Asia than in Europe or the United States. So this is early stage compared to the rest of the world. But we are seeing more and more companies involved in private equity. And because we have a huge revolution in startups in China, in India, and now increasingly in Indonesia, there is a lot of money actually going into venture capitalists. And so venture capital funds have proliferated both at the early stage and at the later stage. There's a lot of excitement about technology and its potential. And in countries that have enormous scale, there's the potential for very rapid escalation in values. And this has excited a lot of investors. So rather than traditional private equity, we're seeing a lot of money going into venture capital and even angel investing.
Merci. Est-ce que ça vous inspire pour l'Europe?
What do you think of that for Europe? Can you tell me if the insurer will finance venture capital or the private equity? So they diversify their balance sheets. So for us, it is 1% of our assets. And I can tell you it's a potential virtual high yield. And of course, you have to consider what we call smart investment. And allow me to talk about regulators and supervisors. I was a bit scathing with them. But these people, they use forecast models. And with these forecast models, they will infer the automatic consequences that will appear. But in real life, there are some people who, when you are about to bump into a wall, driving at 100 kilometers per hour, you turn the driving wheel, but the regulator doesn't understand that. So it means that companies, economic agents are able to respond faced with the increase in risks. So the cost of a final risk is less high than the forecasts of the model. So we need to instill a bit of trust. The regulators should trust the professionals. The customers should trust the professionals. Professional people are not bad guys who want to cheat. They want to survive. And they want to be accepted by regulators. And they want people who are ready to pay for their services. Of course, we want to get clients for the long haul. So people think that we are bad operators, that we are thieves, but that's not the case because our future would be quite uncertain. So if the world was to be was to be characterized with no uncertainties, the regulator could impose a good rule to anybody. But we are living in an uncertain world. And when you consider risks, the risk environment, there are lots of unknowns. For example, if we had asked a regulator what were the major risks 3 years ago, the regulator wouldn't have highlighted the pandemic risk. But very often, regulators will choose the level of risks that you will be taking. A risk that will occur every 200 years, but is it the right level of risk in order to get 1% of productivity gain? I don't know. I think that regulators have to take up a challenge. They need to ponder over the right level of risks for the financial intermediaries, for the brokers in a global society. what is the optimum? What is the optimal approach? If I say every 400 years, the society that would abide by that would be a stagnating society. And I think that regulators should think about that, because it's quite urgent. There's a sense of urgency. So to echo what Philippe said, so risks, this is something that is political as well. We think that it's only technical. We think that we'll be able to model risks. We think that we'll be able to use the genius of finance to mitigate risks. But I think that states and companies shouldn't pass on the message whereby we can protect everybody, the fact that there's a welfare state that can protect everybody. But I don't think that this approach will work on the long haul because of globalization. This is the message that we need to put across to young generations, and they've understood all that. So thank you. There's a sense of urgency. We need to change quickly to rebuild trust and confidence in the long term, on the long haul. So we need to invest in the long run. Of course, we could have said many things, we could have debated many things, but I hope that we'll be able to meet again to talk about these issues. Thank you.